You know what was really annoying about New Year's Eve this past year? I kept trying to find coverage that my children could watch too. You know what I'm talking about? Like, all I wanted was a fireworks display and maybe a shiny ball dropping down. That's all I was looking for. And so, kind of maybe with some musical guests or something. That's what I was looking for. But we were doing it really early in the day. And so I turn on my first choice. I don't even remember what it was, but I was looking for something like, I'm thinking Disney Channel Christmas Parade, like that kind of a thing. And I turn it on, and you got the sparkling juice for the kids and some snackies. And life hack, if you have small children, we watch the fireworks that are live in Hong Kong at 8 p.m. I was in bed by 10:30 that night, right? Hashtag dad life, right? That's just how we do it. And so it's New Year's Eve, and I'm looking for coverage. I'm looking for something for my kids to watch, and all the big programming is like later in the night. So I'm looking for something, and I open it up, and the first thing was a news story. And the host lady, she says, in our year-end review of 2024, we are now going to summarize the worst criminal court cases of 2024, starting with this serial killer and rapist. And I'm like, find the remote, stop, turn it off. Like, what's happening? Oh. I don't remember what we did. I think we ended up just watching a movie. It was like, forget it. I don't want to, I can't even turn on the news anymore with children in the room. But after New Year's Eve, there was a clip from the coverage that went viral. It was from their Peacock, the NBC coverage. And there was a show that they were doing with Kenan Thompson and Kevin Hart. And it was called 2024 Back That Year Up. And they had a bunch of guests video in or interview and all that kind of stuff. And there was a moment where they brought on the comedian Nate Bargatze. You guys know Nate Bargatze, right? So he was on a Zoom call. If you don't know him, he's one of the biggest comedians in the entire world right now. But he sticks out because he's what we would call a clean comedian. He doesn't curse and he doesn't tell vulgar stories. He's a comedian you can watch with kids in the room. And so during the show, Kevin Hart, who's another comedian, he asked him, he said, Nate, you don't cuss on stage. Do you drop F-bombs at home? And Nate says, no, I don't. And he starts talking about how he doesn't curse because he goes into this whole thing about how comedians, they used to have to go through TV. And TV has censors and rules about what you can say. And so comedians used to have a filter. But now everything is just uploaded directly to the internet. And so a lot of modern comedians don't have that filter like some of these other comedians. And Kevin Hart, who's a very funny and successful comedian, he says, well, look, let me show you how TV works now. And then he just starts cursing, just every curse word you can think of. And he just spouts it all. And he gets a big laugh from the crowd because they know it's all going to be bleeped out, right? And then he invites Nate to curse. He says, go ahead, give me one, Nate, just one time. And there's a pause and they switch over to the Zoom call. And Nate he looks so confused. And he's like, oh, no, I'm not going to do that. I didn't even realize you were talking to me because that's not my thing. Now, I'm not going to go into the ethics of curse words, right? The Bible talks about avoiding words that are foul and abusive, but that's not the same thing as a list of words you can and can't say, right? I think you can actually avoid curse words and still use your words to hurt people. That's a whole other message, but that's not my point today. My point is that clip went viral because it was sort of a strange, very public display of peer pressure, right? It was like, come on, do a thing that's against your conscience in order to fit in. Be like us. And so in the comedy world, being a clean Christian sets Nate apart. Now, let's ask ourselves, do you ever wonder in your life what sets you apart in people's minds? In the way that you live your life as a husband or a wife, as a parent, a coworker, student, what is it about your life that sets you apart as a Christian? Today, we are diving into a series called Resilient, A Life Built to Last. And we're going over the story of Daniel, chapter 1. And if you want to open up your Bibles, you can look that up, look it up on your phone. In the new year, I think it's a brilliant goal to set a goal for yourself. I'm going to go to church, I'm going to bring my Bible. But if you forgot, or you just want to grab one off the wall, or you can look it up on there's great Bible apps. But while you are flipping over to Daniel chapter 1, if you were here with us last week, let me set the stage a little bit. The short version is that Daniel was this young Jewish man whose city got conquered and then by the empire of Babylon. Then they deported him as an exile to the capital city, which was called Babylon. Now, exiles are stripped of their identity. They were made as servants or slaves to their captors. So Daniel and his buddies, they're going to work for King Nebuchadnezzar. And so that's all in chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. And then it says in verse 3, It says, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal families and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure that they're well-versed in every branch of learning and are gifted with knowledge and good judgment and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. Okay, so I know it's kind of a bummer that they have to be servants in the palace or whatever. But I'm looking at this job description, right? Strong, healthy, good-looking, well-educated, suited to serve. I mean, it's kind of flattering, right? Like sure, they're servants. That's a bummer. But like, these are the primo. This is the top. This is the Ivy League of servants, right? The king tells the chief of staff, find these young men and then start training them. It keeps going in verse 5. And it says, the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens, and they were to be trained for 3 years. Then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. And the chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Now, if you're dealing with tricky names like Mishael and Azariah, right, I can understand wanting to give them new names. I don't want to pronounce that. That's tricky to say. But then in verse 7, it says, Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. And Azariah was called Abednego. Because we all know the most common nickname for Daniel is Belteshazzar. That's catchy, right? No, but we talked about this last week, right? This isn't about giving them easier names. This is about stripping away their identity, right? We talked about this. They want Babylonian names. They're stripping away their identity as people of Israel, as people of God. They're giving them brand new names to tell them, hey, come on, get with the program. Be like us. And then we get to the most important part, which is verse 8. And verse 8, it says, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and the wine given to them by the king. And he asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat the unacceptable food. Now, to understand that line, we got to back up a little bit, all the way back to the book of Leviticus, right? Hundreds of years before Daniel, the people of God were given something called the Levitical Code. It was a list of do's and don'ts. It was like legal code, right? Long story short, Israel gets out of Egypt, right? They were slaves in Egypt. They get out of Egypt. They are headed to the promised land. When they get there, they're going to mix in with a bunch of other types of people who are not the people of God. And those people have strange practices and rituals, and they worship other gods. And so God gave his people a code that was going to set them apart. He gave them a code that would set them apart from the people who worship other gods. And so it was like, here's how you do sacrifices. Here's how you do ritual cleanings. And it's a little bit boring, and a little bit gross, actually. It's why if you see a Bible verse on a coffee mug, it's not going to be out of Leviticus, right? Like, that's very rare. But it also included stuff on what they eat, what they should wear, even how they trim their beards. And it was designed as a system. The Levitical Code was a system designed to make them stick out. They would be different from their neighbors because they were God's people. Now, I know this is a bit of a tangent, but it's really important. In the Old Testament, there are some laws that are moral code, right? Designed to help us follow the way of Jesus. There's a lot of rules about don't have sex with anyone or anything that's not your spouse. Don't murder people, don't lie. And then the easy moral codes to follow. And then they show up again in the New Testament, and they continue to be effective in our lives. But there's another bucket of laws that are designed to set the Jewish people apart. Here's how you're going to be different. Here's how you're going to stick out. You're going to be God's people. Now, this is why it's important. When Jesus came, he gave us a new standard that sets us apart. Our standard is not beards or food or circumcision. Our standard is love of God and love of neighbor. Christianity is set apart not by a Levitical code, but by how much we love. And there's this really cool story in the New Testament with Peter. I'll paraphrase it because we don't have time to get into it. It's in Acts chapter 10 if you want to look it up. But basically, Peter, there's this guy Peter, and he gets a vision from God. And he looks up to heaven, and there's like this big sheet that comes down. And in the sheet is a bunch of animals on it. Animals he's not supposed to eat. The code says, don't eat this stuff. And he hears a voice from heaven that says, go ahead, eat the food. And Peter, like the good Jewish man that he was, he said, oh, no. Our Jewish laws declare that unclean. And the voice from heaven replies and says, do not call something unclean if God has made it clean. And that line, that's super important because it was unclean, but God made it clean. And then meanwhile, while this was happening, there's like a guy at the door. And there's a Roman soldier named Cornelius. And he's asking to speak with Peter. Now, the Jewish rules, the Levitical code said, don't do it. Don't hang out with non-Jewish people. But Peter, he has this vision from heaven about the food and unclean and clean. And then he's looking at Cornelius' messenger and he's thinking about that vision that he just had. And he says this in chapter 10, verse 28. Acts chapter 10, verse 28, he says, Peter told them, you know it's against our laws for a Jewish man to enter the Gentile home like this or to associate with you. But God has shown me that I should no longer think of anyone as impure or unclean. So Jewish people were set apart by this code of behavior. Eat these food, wear these clothes, hang out with only these types of people. But Jesus taught Peter something different. Jesus cracked open the holiness code and he said, the thing that's going to set you apart is not your menu, it's your love. Now, the reason I get so fired up about this is sometimes I hear people say, if you eat shellfish and you're a Christian, then you're a hypocrite. You're just picking and choosing what to follow in the Bible. And it's like, no, we are following a consistent interpretation of Scripture using Peter and Cornelius. It gives us a new model. What was unclean, God has made it clean. That's why Christians don't have the same dietary rules as Jewish people, because that's what God does. He takes the unclean and makes it clean. The Bible is the best way to interpret the Bible. Sometimes people will ask me about my tattoos. Right? They'll say, wait, I thought the Bible said no tattoos. How can you have tattoos? And they're right. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 27, no tattoos. Wait, it's verse 28. 27 says, don't trim your beard. And let me tell you, okay, if I believed that having no tattoos is how we were supposed to be set apart, if that's how I show my devotion to God, I wouldn't have tattoos, right? Because at the time of the Levitical code, there was another people group who lived next to Israel. And they had this religion where they had ritual tattoos as a sign of devotion to their false god. It was like a part of their grieving process. When someone died, they would like carve their name they would permanently mark their skin. That's why it says have no tattoos. When the Jewish people didn't have tattoos, it was a way to be set apart. And if I lived back then, I wouldn't have tattoos. Yes? Because, but God has taken what was unclean and made it clean. And modern Christians, we are set apart not by a Levitical code or having no tattoos. We are set apart by how much we love Jesus. You following me with all that, right? And so Daniel was presented with this meal, and he's got to make a decision. Verse 8, it says Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and the wine that was given to him by the king. So Daniel, he's this kid. He's a young man, he's a kid, and he was captured, taken to a foreign land, and he's trying to figure out, how do I remain a man of God? And how do I stay true to honoring God in a world that is over here encouraging me, just fit in, just do it, just fit in. And holy smokes, isn't that exactly the question for you and I today? How can we live as men and women of God in a world and a society that just wants us to fit in? How can we be set apart in a world that is built on a foundation that is different from the teachings of Jesus? Let me give you an example. When I was in college, I would come home during the summers, and I worked for the city of Troy. That's where my parents were living at the time. It paid better than TCBY. And I had a job at the Parks Department. I did a lot of weed whipping in the summer. And it was mostly summer workers like college students, and then a whole bunch of older blue-collar construction guys who worked on the streets crew. It was the kind of job where you had to buy your own steel-toed boots. I got good ones. They lasted me like 10, 15 years. But not to stereotype, but we would eat lunch, and it was in this cafeteria area in the city of Troy. And the conversation would get a little colorful. A lot of the guys, they like to talk about what they did over the weekend and some of the women that they had been with and all that kind of stuff. Now, I could have kept my mouth shut. Just eat my sandwich, go back to work, keep weed whipping. I didn't have to participate in the conversation. But I remember there was this nudge in my heart. Like God was like, no, you this is not how I've taught you to be. And so when the conversation got to me, they were kind of going around the circle telling stories and stuff. And they got to me and they're like, hey, I bet you've got some stories. I was like, oh, no. No, I'm a virgin. And I was 22 at the time. And at the time, like, I don't know what it is like with young people nowadays, but when I was working in the city of Troy, admitting you were a virgin labeled you as a loser, right? That's what happened for me. And I told him, I was like, so I spoke up and I said, yeah, no, I don't think that's how I can follow God, right? That's not how I was raised. That's not how I think I can follow God. I'm not good with that. I don't think that's how we should treat women as objects to be conquered. I'm a Christian, so I'm not gonna have sex until I am married. And I know I lost a lot of social capital that day. I was not one of the cool kids after that lunch. Some of the guys respected it. They were like, yeah, that's cool. And then they kind of looked at each other like, that guy's nuts, right? They were like, oh, what? They wrote me off as crazy. But the question is, how can we be set apart in a world that is built on a different foundation than the teachings of Jesus? And for me, one of the ways that I did that is I do have, some of these guys had a list. I do have a list of all the women I have ever slept with, but I call it my marriage license. And I do want to say, I don't say that in judgment. Like if you're here this morning and things have happened in your life, there is grace. There's forgiveness. There is healing. I'm not better than you. Don't ever hear me say that, right? I'm not better than other people. This was just one of my ways to be set apart as a Christian in this world. And I think for Daniel, it was sort of obvious, right? God says, don't eat this, and the king says, eat this. And it's like, no, I'm not going to do it. That's an obvious choice. Don't do that thing. But I think sometimes in life, it's not as obvious what we should do to stand out. Like, what do we do when it's not black and white? What do we do in that gray area? I remember there's a story in the book of Corinthians, and there were these Christians who were struggling with food in the marketplace. Imagine this. Just imagine you go to the grocery store or like BYRON Center Meats. Anybody ever been there? I just went there the first time like a couple days ago. It was awesome. It's a nice place. It's really cool. And so anyways, imagine you go in there and you go into the grocery store and you find some food. Some of the meat that is for sale has been sacrificed to a false god. Like there's a pagan temple up the road and that's where they source the meat from, right? And that's what they're doing. And the question is, are you allowed to buy that meat? Because let's say it's on sale, right? It's much cheaper than the other meat, right? Are you allowed to buy that meat? And if you do, if you eat that meat, are you supporting the pagan god? Like actually think about that for a second. If you found out there's meat in the grocery store, you're like at the meat counter, and you find out some of it is sourced from the pagan temple up the road, would you buy it? Right? Like there's the FDA approved pulled pork, and there's the grass-fed organic beef, and then there's the pagan temple pork chops, right? Like it's all just right there. And the Christians in that church all those years ago, they were divided. They didn't know what to do. And some of them were like, yeah, it's just meat. Like, it doesn't matter. I don't worship that God. It's just meat. But there were others who were like, no, dude, don't touch that meat. And you can go look this up. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And Paul has this brilliant response. He says, okay, look, we know up in our heads that food is just food. The food that you can eat it or not eat it, whatever, doesn't matter. What matters is in your heart. And he has this nuance. He's like, look, some of you grew up in that church. You were in that pagan temple. Some of you grew up sacrificing to that. So if you eat it, to you, it will be supporting that temple. So you should not eat it. He says this. This is in chapter 8, verse 7. I love this. 1 Corinthians. He says, however, not all believers know this. Some of you are accustomed to thinking of idols as being real. So when they eat the food that's been offered to the idols, they think of it as worship to a real God, and their weak conscience is violated. It's true. We can't win God's approval by what we eat. We don't lose anything if we eat it. We don't gain anything if we do. But you must be careful so that your freedom does not cause others with a weaker conscience to stumble. For if others see you with your superior knowledge, it's actually in quotes, eating in the temple of an idol, wouldn't they be encouraged to violate their conscience by eating food that's been offered to an idol? So because of your superior knowledge, a weak believer for whom Christ died will be destroyed. And when you sin against other believers by encouraging them to do something that they believe is wrong, you're sinning against Christ. So if what I eat causes another believer to sin, I will never eat meat again as long as I live, for I don't want to cause another believer to stumble. Isn't that beautiful? It's like, is eating this meat sinful? And Paul's like, look, technically not, right? I know it's not, it's just meat. I'm not worshiping that God, but to my friend, he struggles with this. He thinks it is worship because he is worshiping that other God. So even though I know this is just a barbecue sandwich, when I hang out with that guy, I'm not going to eat that meat. I'm not touching it because I don't want another believer to stumble. I want us both to succeed at being set apart. I think sometimes in life, the line is so clear. It's so obvious, but there is gray areas. And the question for us always should be, how do you remain set apart as a follower of Jesus? So let's jump back in with Daniel. I know that was kind of a rabbit's trail, but it's important. We got to understand. So Daniel lives under this Levitical code, right? This is how his people show their love of God. They were set apart by what they eat. You might remember, for Jewish people, it was no bacon, right? These people understood what it was to sacrifice. These people, they knew. But he's in the palace, and he's recruited for the servant's job, and he's going to give him food that he can't eat. And so here's what he does. This is Daniel chapter 1, verse 9. And it says, now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. And so this messenger guy, he's like, look, I like you, man. I want to help you out, but I got a job to do. You're going to get me in trouble. I don't want to get in trouble. So Daniel proposes a test. And he says, Daniel spoke to the chief attendant and he said, please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. And at the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. And the attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. So he proposes this test. He's like, look, let me try. Let me follow God's way for 10 days and see what happens. And it doesn't have any bad consequences. And so it finishes up verse 15. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than all the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So in this little story, following God works out great for Daniel. No consequences. He's able to stay set apart and doesn't have anything bad happen to him. Now, if you know the book of Daniel, you know this is the only time that happens. The rest of the story is much worse, but we'll get to that later. The good news I have for you today, and this is the thing I really want you to hang on to, is that God sets us apart. Literally, the definition of holy is to be set apart. God wants us to be holy. Jewish folks like Daniel, they were set apart because of their diet, because of their grooming, the ritual cleaning and sacrifices. But for Christians, we have the same need to be set apart, the same need to claim our identity as God's people. I'm going to follow Jesus, and so I'm going to be different than the rest of the world. But Jesus taught us, he's like, it's not going to be about your meals. It's not going to be about your clothes. It's not going to be about about your rituals. What sets us apart is our love of God and love of our neighbor. John 13, verse 35, he says, by this, everyone will know you are my disciples, if you love one another. Love for God, that means obedience to his word, following the way he has taught us to live, right? And then love of our neighbor, that's where we sacrifice for other people, where we serve other people in our lives. That's how we are set apart from the rest of the world. Because let me ask you, if you did not own a church shirt and you don't have the little WWJD bracelet or the cross necklace, you don't have the fish bumper sticker on your car, if you have no labels that identify you as a Christian, could someone outside your life guess that you were a Christian? Can somebody figure out just from how you live? Do you live your life with a radical level of love where the only way anyone could explain that is obedience to God? They just look at you and they're like, wow, the way that guy is loving people, he must be a Christian. Because here's the thing, and we talked about this a bit back last week. The world is changing. It wasn't that hard to follow Jesus when everyone around you is doing the same thing. Our parents and grandparents, they went to church back in the glory days and all their friends are Christian and all the programmings are bursting. And it's like this huge thing. They did not face the same world that we do. They do not have to deal with the same obstacles and temptations that we deal with. Our exile has become more obvious. And we can bemoan that, we can complain, or we can embrace it. We have an opportunity to be set apart. It's easier than ever. So let me ask you one question and finish out this morning. Where do you need to be set apart to align with God's world in a world that's going the other way? I think about the people of Corinth and how they had to figure out how to be set apart with the whole pagan temple meat issue. And I think about Daniel, who's trying to draw his lines with his new servant job and the food he's allowed to eat. And so in my life, I know I've had to draw some lines. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm a Christian. I'm going to do things a little different. So what are your lines? Where do you have to draw a line and say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm a Christian. Maybe your line as a parent, if you've got little kids, is refusing to compromise on screens or technology just because everybody else is doing it. Or maybe you're competing with a coworker on who can take the best vacation. You just draw a line and say, no, you win. And you take your whole vacation fund and donate it to a homeless shelter. Maybe there's a substance in your life, drugs, alcohol, pills, whatever, and you just need to draw a line and get that addiction out of your life. Maybe you draw a line with social media. And you say, you know what, I'm not going to be online as much. And that's going to mean you're a little out of the loop. You're not up to date on the latest internet gossip because you were spending time with God instead. No, I haven't caught the latest episode of that TV show. I needed to prioritize my time with God a bit. Or maybe it's saying no traveling sports team for me, for my kids, because it just removes you from your family or from your family of God for too long. Like I'm not up here to turn it into a Levitical code. I just want you to take some time this week. Look at your life and ask, where do I need to be set apart with how I live and how I love so that my life lines up with the way of Jesus? Let's pray. Dear Jesus, we know we were made for more. We were meant to be set apart as your people. We know that you love us. You have claimed us. But God, it's so hard. There's such a strong desire just to fit in, to just blend in with the rest of a culture that's going against what you have taught, Lord. And it's so easy to make excuses or to kind of rationalize ourselves into looking exactly like our non-Christian neighbors. But God, you called us to stick out. You called us to live in such a way that our love would draw attention, that people would look at us and wonder, why do they do that? Why are they so kind? Why are they so joyful and peaceful and loving and compassionate? All the fruits of the Spirit, Lord. Why are they like that? And we can just point to God and say, I'm just trying to be set apart for Jesus. For each of us who are here today, show us where we need to draw our lines. Show us where you want us to be set apart. Show us how you want your love to shine through our lives. We love you so much. Amen.